Hello, sorry I'm late. All right, so I have four of you. So we're doing the War of 1812, okay? This time.
What section did we leave off on last week? Are we going
We,
over the same great man history of the early republic?
no, I threw all three presidents in one assignment, and I
Okay.
did the lecture on all three. Yeah.
So we're doing which one?
So we are doing the War of 1812.
Okay.
All right. No, I'm glad you asked. So yeah, I know that was a lot to put in one assignment. I may alter that in the future, but hopefully you guys uh, in ingested the basics, right?
Did you send a review over for that for the War of 18?
You know what? I may not have.
Okay.
Yeah, if I haven't it should be on there. Do you mean the assignment, or what do you
Yes.
mean by review?
Yeah, because I print them out. So when you go through when we're on these like these Zooms, I kind of like
Sure.
read through it as you're talking, and
Sure.
I couldn't find it. I'm not finding it.
No problem. So yeah, I will as soon as I'm done with the video with this Zoom, I'll make sure it's on there, okay? And so if it's not, I'll put it on there. So yeah, that's what you're doing next is the War of 1812, and it's different. You're going to have an assignment like you had the assignment with the Constitution. Notice it was different, right? It was anomalous in that it wasn't in the same argumentative format. Same thing here. This is more old school, just basic questions from a video that I have posted the URL for. You just go to the video, watch it, and answer the questions. It's pretty old school, pretty simple. Not a format that I'm particularly proud of. That's why I only do it on one topic. But to be honest, I was just stretching my time and resources on making an argumentative assignment out of the War of 1812. It's kind of upfront, you know, and so yeah, I made an exception with it. All right, and so if you don't mind, Bella, could you type or tell me your I know you have before your last name, hun? Would you be willing to do that so I could make sure that I get you credit? I probably can discern it from the
Yeah,
list
sorry,
in case I have a couple
type it in. For
Isabellas.
some reason I can't get it, but it's Garcia.
Garcia. Okay,
Garcia.
thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, perfect. All right. Any other questions or comments before we go to the assignment? Okay. All right, so I'm going to share the screen as usual, or as of late. And so the War of 1812, right here, very upfront assignment. Like I said, old school, not a format of which I'm particularly proud for the simple reason, right? When I first started teaching, there were pamphlets that I got a hold of on critical thinking. And it talks about, right, like different levels, layers that you undergo uh, um, involved with critical thinking and analysis, picking apart what you're reading, and then synthesizing material together to evaluate it, how credible it is, for instance, right? Those constitute, somewhat respectable levels of thinking. With this, right, a lot of this is regurgitation. You're looking at a video, you're looking at basic facts. You have to infer from here and there, things that may not be absolutely upfront, and just the answer is just explicitly stated to just do a little bit of connecting of the dots. But besides that, it's very superficial level thinking involved. So notice the questions, right? I mean, who did the U.S. fight in the War of 1812? How was Canada connected to the story? What reason or two is given for poor American military prowess, at least initially in the war? How does William Henry Harrison play the villain in the narrative? What were the two official reasons for which the U.S. declared war? How is Tecumseh portrayed in the video? Give an example or two. How did Detroit earn a negative story in the book? And of course, there's just a definitive answer to that. What is the story of the Star Spangled Banner? Like I said, this is really kind of elementary level, something that I probably should improve upon. It should be pretty simple, but it will be a little bit time consuming because you have to watch the video, and the video's a little lengthy, and I apologize. All right. How is the story of Oliver Hazard Perry, or what is the story? And then the Battle of New Orleans, how is it depicted? So what I want to do is give you a broader picture of the War of 1812, all right, and give you like the historical context in a basic narrative of the war. It should give you a pretty big head start before delving into the video, okay? So again, before I began blabbing, are there any questions or comments?
I do, sorry, real quick. Are you
No, it's
gonna
okay.
post this up as like slides? Are you gonna put what you're showing us today?
Yes, yeah,
as a link?
this is the exact assignment.
Okay,
So yeah, this is exactly what is going to be posted.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So remember, right? Let's see here. Where do I begin? We oftentimes when people look at the War of 1812, all right, they see it as us coming of age. Oftentimes when you look at different wars or anything for that matter, they try to string a chronology and narrative together, right? As far as what's the bigger picture, what did this contribute to, what did this kind of morph evolve into, et cetera, et cetera. And most often it seems in the books that I've grabbed a hold of concerning the War of 1812 is the whole kind of functional history. Functional history, right? Like with sociology, they don't look at good guys and bad guys and get into conflict as far as power and who dominates politically, economically, and socially. They do, but that's not their main focus. Their main focus, right, is trying to treat society as like a living organism, like a human body, right? And they look at the different parts to society. They look at the different, for instance, demographics, right? Like the merchants and bankers and business owners in the New England places, right? The Federalist Party that they tended to gravitate to. Then you have right the Democratic Republicans who are more libertarian and kind of afraid of the Constitution and were opposed to Hamilton's system, right? And had largely voted for Jefferson and his successor Madison, right? They also tended to be more in favor of this war, and you look at the demographic of the famous war hawks, those who wanted to extend our territory, and tended to be Democratic Republicans again, more libertarian. Wanted the Republic in their platform to lean more toward the Democratic side than the aristocratic or monarchical side. Um, you also you look at people in the West battling it out on the frontier between the states, those on the western periphery of their own state against the establishment of their own state, namely their legislator and governor, fighting for their rights and representation. Not to mention fighting with Native Americans, right? Because there's oftentimes squatting on Native American land, to which the Native American tribes often did not take too kindly. And you also look at the the coming of the Civil War, right? Which won't be until 1861, but nevertheless, people will look to that and say, okay, what are some trends? What are some themes, right, that are going to recur and might even actually lead that we could tie to the Civil War, for instance, right, and how we developed. So generically, the War of 1812 oftentimes is depicted as a patriotic war. Um, it's going to um, it's going to end with the absence of the federal party, or the demise or death, basically, of the Federalist Party. A period in which a journalist wrote that there was an era of good feeling that had come across the country, and he meant that partisanship, right, between the two parties had dissipated momentarily. And so you'll see that era of good feeling theme connected oftentimes to the latter 18 teens and early 1820s. Um, you look at the irony, somewhat, or paradox, that the Democratic Republicans are largely going to end up by the end of the war embracing, although the Federalist Party's gone, right? So you'd think that now they have full sway in Congress and the presidential seat, to have their way, to bring about a kind of libertarian platform, a Jeffersonian vision for the country. But the ironic thing is that does not happen, right? Instead, the country is going to arguably evolve more in a Hamiltonian vision or pattern. Remember, Hamilton wanted commercialization. He wanted commerce or trade connecting all the different states and regions of the country, right? And have us connected to the international economy. And not to mention, he wanted a credit system that was available with a national bank and credit available to would-be entrepreneurs starting businesses or starting cash crop farms, right? He wanted urbanization, people moving primarily into cities. And in those cities, he wanted people to, he wanted the local economies to diversify. He wanted them to create many different industries, right? So the first big one arguably was textiles, clothing, the manufacture of clothing and shoes. And then, of course, the next big one arguably would be metallurgy, products made of iron or steel. And so that's a bit ironic, right? So we're going to galvanize as a country in the sense of our patriotism. We're also going to, arguably by the 1820s and for certain by the 1830s, there's evidence that we're going to evolve toward having our own culture, having kind of declaring cultural independence from Mother England. Because after all, right, we're speaking English. The notions of private property, common law, Christianity, all kinds of remnants of English civilization survive with us to this day. Not to mention, a lot of the population back then was less diverse than it is today. The population was much more WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, many people from the English Isles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, etc. And so we're going to declare independence in that, something as symbolic as like Webster's dictionary, and whereby he's going to he's going to truncate a lot of words, right? Like honor, HONOUR they're going to take off the U, right, of that word. Something as seemingly trivial and symbolic as that is we're declaring our cultural independence. We're contending, right, that we speak American English, right? And not to mention, we're going to have a movement with Romanticism that'll come about a decade after this war, which we're going to change and make into our own movements, most famously the Transcendental movement that we'll get into in the future. So we're declaring our independence, right, from England in particular and from Europe. We're going in our own direction. We're growing economically, ironically, kind of in Hamilton's direction, but we're growing nevertheless, right, et cetera, et cetera. So we oftentimes tie the War of 1812 to those things that we're kind of we're growing up. We're growing up and we're becoming who we're going to become, for better and for worse. When I say for worse, we're going to cement, right, or at least, I don't know about cement, because obviously it doesn't last up through the Civil War, but for a time period, we're going to cement our concession to slavery and people spreading it westwardly. The abolitionist and those bourgeois opposers to the spread of slavery from namely the northeastern states are not going to really prevail until later on. And so the notion of granting lands to the West to voters, basically in return for their vote. This is going to really manifest itself in the Jacksonian time period in the late 1820s and early 1830s. And so that's going to be a common theme that you could tie easily to the War of 1812 as well. All right. And so the causes, the alleged causes of the War of 1812, right, were that well, I guess you would say that the international events that were happening served as the sparks. Maybe not necessarily the inherent causes, but at least the sparks that set it off. And namely, right, we've talked about the French Revolution and the Continental or Napoleonic Wars back in Europe, right? Remember, with the Berlin Decrees and the British Council, Napoleonic France and Great Britain are going to make edicts that arguably go against what was already perceived to be international law. That is a very fascinating subject in and of itself. You could look up just war doctrine, right? The just war, the notion of a just war. It goes back at least as early to August of Hippo, and the Catholic Church, and basically putting things into two categories broadly: the reason for which you fight and the manner by which you fight have to be approved by the church and considered just or legitimate or justified. And then in that case, you can go ahead and engage in war and not worry about being held for the sin of murder by the church and by God, should you kill someone in battle. And so that is going to kind of morph throughout the medieval and early modern era into having these conventions, if you will, in Europe, whereby they start agreeing upon certain principles that they're going to follow in the conduct of war. And one of those, right, that seemed to be pretty salient, it was always there and easily visible, was the notion of neutral countries and non-belligerents, for that matter, people who are not wearing um, uniforms, that they are to be left alone, right? That you're to fight, and it'd be like football players, fully padded up, running into the stands and starting to tackle, some of the fans on the bleachers. Such was the notion that you don't contend against non-combatants, and also in particular countries that want to declare neutrality while two nations or more are at war, that they have the right of the seas. They have the open right to trade along the sea routes, right? But of course, they would put up a list, and it could not go against that list of prohibited items. And you can make an easy guess as far as what those prohibited items entailed: any type of military products, right? Because then you're not truly being neutral if you're selling guns or cannon to one of the two fighting sides. So we call that against the list or contraband, right? So during the Napoleonic Wars, we were supposed to, there was already a diplomatic and European tradition and notion that we should have been free to trade our food, our clothing, and other non-war materiel to one or either side during these wars. But both sides violated that, right? And they began initiating naval blockades against each other. And the notion was, right, is it wasn't meant to be directed toward us as any kind of punitive fashion. It just simply was meant to starve out, right, their enemy. And toward us, if anything, as the video implies, it was high-handed, it was haughty, it was arrogant. Like, well, who cares about the Americans and these little American merchants, right? And kind of discarding their rights. So at any rate, it happened on both sides. Remember, we had a quasi war with our Navy against the French in the Caribbean. But now, right, a lot of attention is going to be drawn toward the British as opposed to the French during these wars for their violations of those rights. What also begins to become publicized highly is impressment. The English, right? It was very common for the English Navy to come in for, well, later on it'd be for coal for their steam engines, but not yet. But for various reasons, they would come and come into port into Charleston or Baltimore or Boston, etc. And they would allow their British troops, a night or two free in the city, um, uh, before they would embark somewhere else into the British Caribbean or somewhere, right, etc. And so the British Navy had at times conscription where they would draft young kids. They had, some constitutionally and morally dubious practice of taking never-do-wells, kids that would get arrested more than once, kids that were seen as paupers, who were just simply mouths to feed and were homeless on the streets of Bristol, Liverpool, and London. And they would force them into the Navy. So you had a contingent of Brits that were in their Navy who obviously did not want to be. And the conditions were notorious in the Navy in the early 1800s in virtually any major naval power country, but especially England's. And so they would take a chance oftentimes and literally run away. And I remember at that time, I'd love to know more about the evolution of dialect, right? Like you have a Southern dialect, a Boston and New York distinct dialect, Australian, Scottish, Irish, all kinds of different dialects and accents of the same English language. But I would imagine that that is an evolutionary process. It takes time. So arguably, as we're living amongst the British in the War of 1812, just a generation before, I don't know how distinctive, an American dialect had become as opposed to a British dialect speaking the same English language. But again, because the population, and we have census stats to prove this, the population was much more WASP here in America back then, right? Where a lot of us were of English or Scottish heritage. The British didn't look much different. You couldn't physically delineate between a Brit and an American as easily as you could a Brit and an African slave or a freed African American, obviously, etc. So they would just kind of disappear into the population. And then you had the press coverage and legislators dealing with people making a business of writing phony American citizenship papers and birth certificates for Brits. Because, of course, you don't have photography, social security numbers, fingerprints, or anything like that yet. And so there was a way of forging a false identification as a Brit, saying that you were an American born in North Carolina, right? Whereas in reality, you were a Brit born in Liverpool. So at any rate, the Brits, they catch wind of this and they get more desperate during the Napoleonic Wars, right? And so they get even more high-handed in the way that they treated American merchants and Americans in general during the war at this point. So what they began doing is they began becoming more liberal and giving a general writ, a WRIT, kind of like a judicial, what's the word I'm thinking of? Someone needs that permission against illegal search and unreasonable search and seizure. They need probable cause, right? And so a warrant. And so at any rate, they began more liberally granting those out to the British Navy, whereby they would stop an American merchant vessel and say, we have the right to do this. We're going to check for contraband, and we're going to check for any runaway British Navy young men, right? And if we find any on your ship, we're going to impress them. We're going to forcefully bring them back into the British forces and punish them accordingly. Well, this system, right, left room for human error, for taking advantage of such conditions, right? And I don't begin to know how they could ever find an accurate estimate. But some people believe that the number literally got up at least to the high hundreds, if not into the thousands, of American boys, young men, who were wrongfully, erroneously impressed into the British Navy when they came into port cities and when they stopped merchant ships, etc. Right, claiming that they had a runaway, and in many cases it was not a runaway; it was an actual American who had never set foot in England proper. So impressment became a huge issue, right? Like, my goodness, this is pretty much legalized abduction, right? And enforcement of fighting back in Europe. And you even had some Americans come back and even write stories about their adventures, and but also, no matter how romantically the story had been portrayed, many Americans became enraged by this, right? How dare the English be so haughty toward us? Then you also had the fact that in the Great Lakes area, from the French and Indian War, the British had taken Canada, right? So now they're our northern neighbor, even though we've declared independence and won independence from them, and they have grudgingly accepted or conceded in 1783. They had promised in due time to get out of their military forts along the Great Lakes, that some of which were technically on American soil, and they still had not done so. And from 1783 to 1812, my math isn't very good, but I believe that's 17 plus 12. That's a lot of years, right? So at any rate, there was that problem as well. And then you have evidence of collusion between the certain British authorities in Canada itself and in these forts, right, with belligerent Native American leaders. When I say belligerent, I'm using the legal term, not the adjective. The legal term, right, that you're technically declaring war against someone. And so, for instance, right, there were two brothers, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, and his brother Tecumseh, and they were Shawnee amongst many of the tribes in the Ohio Valley, and they were complaining of American mismanagement of lands and theft of lands and bullion and extortion against the Native Americans, which of course had some truth to it. And so there's evidence that they teamed up with some of these Brits and were even armed by them and encouraged to rebel and break free in kind of, quid pro quo fashion. Uh, Brits, you help us and arm us. You help, legally defend our rights to this native land, and we'll help you fight your hated American enemies. And so there was what really sets things off, right, is in the Ohio Valley, right? That area was declared from by us during the War for Independence and just after by our Confederation, right? And remember, they made certain edicts about it. They stated, firstly, right, that slavery will not be allowed in that area. They stated that there will be a process by which that territory will evolve into states, and it was a very methodical process. The land survey office has to come out. They have to give a census. You have to have certain number of people. I know for a while it was 60,000 was a big number, but you have to have a certain thousand number of people that are counted that as inhabitants there who are claiming their affiliation with the United States. The land survey office breaks things into square acre plots, and so many of them will constitute cities, so many of them counties, so many of them a future state, and open up for public sale the lands therein. But then with public sale, you had Native Americans who claim, wait a minute, this is our land. How could you, come and survey it and offer it to the highest bidders or sell it publicly when it belongs to us without our permission? And then to make things even messier is with the native tribes, right? They not only were fighting against the United States, but they were fighting with one another. So, for instance, the British, on more than one occasion, had granted this land by conquest to the Iroquois tribe. Well, never, it goes without saying, the tribes that were still there and had not been vanquished and were still living and had not been defeated on a battlefield and conceded that land said, no way, it doesn't belong to the Iroquois, because the Iroquois were originally, at least when the English came, in New York. This was not their land. So the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, the Miami, all the Shawnee, the Pawnee, or the Pawnee are a little further away. At that point, also the Cheyenne had moved into there. Lots of different tribes, the Lakota or the Sioux. So it was a jurisdictional mess, and our Confederation would not engage in a respectable, methodical diplomacy to try to, to recognize each tribe's claims to that land and try to work around them, right? But instead, when we start our republic, it gets even worse because George Washington sent in a couple army regiments and gave power to the commanders to serve as virtually as military governors. And remember, a military governor can use executive powers beyond what a regular civilian governor can do, including, most infamously, he could declare martial law, right, whereby your civil liberties are not recognized, and you could shoot first and ask questions later. And remember, the Constitution stated that each state gets to decide on citizenship, and the House of Reps, when they're elected, one for every 30,000 civilians, they're not to count, quote, Indians not taxed. So Native American tribes were separated in the Constitution as separate nations within the nation. So they're not integrated. They're not recognized as citizens. And so a guy named Arthur St. Clair came in there. A guy named, quote, Mad Anthony Wayne came in there. And they ended up fighting against the natives and having pitched battles. You had a guy named Little Turtle. You had a guy before him named Pontiac, who led Native Americans against our Confederate government and early Republic government, right? And in particular, the military governors that were put over them. So At this time, eventually, William Henry Harrison becomes the military governor appointed to that region. And as the video will convey, he couldn't have played a better villain. He was very, very Eurocentric, had the stereotypes not connected to the Enlightenment, that Native Americans were savages and that they were incapable of civilization, that they were inferior biologically. So there was nothing you could do as far as bringing them into a different environment or encouraging or forcing them to assimilate and become like white Americans and their behavior and culture and in their institutions. There was no hope in his eyes. So hence there was no compromise. So he had that haughty arrogance when he came in. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, would have these rallies whereby he would try to unite the Native Americans to reject Christianity because the American government and just churches on their own privately were sending missionaries in there to convert the Native Americans. So Tenskwatawa wanted nothing of that and tried to preach, right, that he had an epiphany as an ex-alcoholic with the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit had told him that if they returned to their Native American religion faithfully and avoided the white man or the paleface's vices, that he would help destroy the paleface and kick them off their land. And so then this spiritual movement, right, began to become persecuted by Governor Harrison. He was frightened by it. He saw it as galvanizing the Native Americans in a rebellious tone, right? And that it would eventually morph into a military rebellion rather than a religious one. And so we don't really know to what extent. It's hard to discern that is true, because you could make the argument that he provoked that military rebellion, right? Rather than it evolving into such, because he began closing down their rallies, trying to find and arrest Tenskwatawa, using the press to try to disparage him, say that he was a scum criminal and a treasonous rebel, and that you should not affiliate with him, et cetera, et cetera. And, to a certain extent, it had the opposite effect as intended. And it started to actually galvanize some of the Native Americans in hating William Henry Harrison in particular, and the arrogance of the American white government. So at this point, William Henry Harrison is going to ask for more troops. He's going to come in and try to arrest these brothers, right? And then when he does so, a fight is going to ensue, right? And as you'll see in the video, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, when they began burying the Native Americans whom they had defeated in this battle, they found that many of the dead Native Americans had been armed with British muskets. So this message was sent to Congress. At this time, there was kind of a change, for lack of a better word, in the constituency of Congress. The old revolutionary generation was retiring. Literally, they were getting too old. And now you have a newer generation. New states like Tennessee, Kentucky, et cetera, right, are being established on the frontier. And they're sending in their 2 senators and 1 rep for every 30,000 civilians, right? So hence Congress becomes by this time more attuned to Western representation, and also just literally more young, right? And the insinuation there is that they're not beholden to the older generation's notions of deference toward England. You say deference toward England, yet we fought a war for independence against them. I get that, right? But you can still find some evidence of there being more conciliation by the founding father generation after the war for independence, when Britain would not allow us to trade with them in the Caribbean, when they bullied us in the Great Lakes. We were like, hey, we don't want to press our luck. We were lucky enough to win our independence. And this new generation, right, literally younger and male, constituted. The insinuation is that they were literally more filled with testosterone, and not to mention with the Western states represented now, you have more Scots-Irish that are there, and or also those who had moved from the Carolinas and Virginia. And so hence they're more in tune to imbibe the culture of the gentry class and the notion of the code duello, right? Where if you and your family's name is impugned by someone, it's your societal and family obligation to challenge that person to a duel. And so hence that whole code of chivalry and all that stuff, right, was more represented amongst these Western congressmen, right? So hence they were more apt to be willing to fight for what they saw were indignities against our nation's dignity and honor by Great Britain. But also, what you have to remember is with a lot of the Westerners wanting to push for this war, they also were presently having a lot of conflict with Native Americans in their own states, right? Because many of the Native American tribes were increasingly moving westwardly, being pushed that way against their will. And so Tennessee, Kentucky, they felt the brunt of that with Native Americans contending this was their land and not the Anglo Americans. And so, at any rate, they had reason to believe that if they could engage in a war against Great Britain and, more importantly, Great Britain's Native American allies, they could do what had been done throughout the entire colonial era, is dispossess those Native Americans of their lands, right, at the end of the war. That is a sad tradition that England brought here and that we will carry out and continue. And that is, right, is once a war is over, the Native Americans say, hey, look back at this previous treaty. You had granted and acknowledged our ownership to this land. And we say, well, that was before the war. You arguably began the war, so we punitively no longer recognize your rights to that land. We have a strong tradition, sadly, of doing that, of dealing punitively with Native Americans at the end of war. So hence, some of these war hawks, if you will, right? Many of them found in the West, they probably had at least partially an ulterior motive. They wanted an excuse to fight the Native Americans, so at the end of the war they could take their lands. And remember, even if they didn't personally want or need the land, like well-to-do politicians, right, like Andrew Jackson and others, they could offer that land to white would-be voters amongst their constituency. And like I said, that's going to be a problem that you find historically with representative democracy, is the temptation of doing the whole quid pro quo. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. I'll grant you the Native Americans' lands in return for your vote. So that's some context that I think you should know to this war being fought. Are there any questions? All right. So another thing, right? An irony is we were actually going to do very, very well or relatively well in naval battles, which is crazy, right? Because, statistically, as far as, warships and reputation for naval prowess, Great Britain had it over us tenfold. But you have to remember, they're fighting a war against Napoleon. So the lion's share of their resources, their men, their finest generals are being used to fight Napoleon, not in the backwater North American continent that they consider to be a sideshow in Parliament. All right. Needless to say, today that Canada is a separate semi-sovereign nation under Great Britain. So clearly, our 3 invasions of Canada did not go out as planned. And there's a notion that you'll see from the video whereby we kind of arrogantly are going to adhere to a manifest destiny, even though that's not going to be coined until the 1840s. It kind of was existing already in the embryo long before. The notion, right, that we have such an exceptionally wonderful country, filled with economic opportunities for more people, filled with political participation by more people, right? With economic flourishing and availability of jobs, of decent wages, of consumer power to buy a growing number of products, that you ought to be grateful for living under the American flag. The whole manifest destiny thing, right? That It's providential. It's God's will that we take over other lands and expand the red, white, and blue flag. But it is for the betterment of the other people. They ought to thank us for it because their lives will improve under the United States. So you have an element of that, that kind of arrogance when we invaded Canada. And needless to say, it didn't work. It didn't go well. And so a lot of the fighting initially will happen in the Ohio Valley and up around the Great Lakes. With the Native Americans, I think the video contends, and I subjectively contend from what I've read, it gets especially vicious down in the South. You could look up something called the Fort Mims Massacre, MIMS, whereby civilians, regular American civilians, had been promised by a British leader that if they came to his British fort, he would protect them as non-combatants, not only from his own British soldiers, but more importantly, from the Native American allies that were fighting with the British, right? Because there was this, great cultural fear, and the press just, fanned this flame that Native Americans did not recognize international rights of warfare, that they would slaughter women and children, mutilate and scalp the bodies, et cetera, right? So there was a great fear of falling under the wrath of what we called at that generation the Red Sticks, the Native American fighters who chose to fight with Britain against us, right? So by the very nature of that definition, it's being implied by me that some Native American tribes, some tribal members chose to fight with us rather than against us. And of course, some tried to stay neutral and stay out of it, right? So a lot of those who fought in famous battles against us rubbed the red ochre on their tomahawks and on their muskets. And so we began calling them in the press Red Sticks, those who fought against us, right? They were the bad guys. So at any rate, despite his promises, and I don't recall to what extent it was volitional by him or it became out of his power, but despite the promises by this British commander in Alabama, Native Americans in particular stormed into Fort Mims and slaughtered all the men, women, and children inside that place. And the press ran with that. And so people like Andrew Jackson, who became in charge of the Tennessee militia, is going to contend that they must pay, right? The Red Sticks must pay. So there developed a lot of populist fear and anger toward the Native Americans. And it became, a kind of a popular bet on your platform if you were a politician, especially in Western states. If you were running for office, it actually was good for your career to be racist toward Native Americans and say, yeah, we want to drive out the Red Sticks and give that land to good, white, God-fearing people, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And we'll talk more about populism under Andrew Jackson later. Notice also the video does a pretty good job in declaring the conflict concerning state militia sovereignty and the federal government. Now, I think subjectively, I am no expert in the Constitution, but from what I understand in Article 1, Section 8 alone, right, Congress has the right to declare war, raise an army, right, from the states, and commandeer militias in the event of an invasion or rebellion. And so, but to many libertarians of that generation, right, this did not sit well with them. Because remember, there was a lot of libertarian rhetoric in our war for independence, right? We did not want big brother, big government, right? Taxing us without our permission, helping us with our finances, and how much less, right? Did we want big brother telling us, you're coming and fighting for the central government. You're going to possibly, jeopardize and even sacrifice your life for big government, right? And so remember during the War for Independence, we had that same theme, right? Where we developed a continental army, but it never got that numerically big. Even someone as feared and respected as George Washington had a hard time with several regiments throughout the country within the states, right? Who said, they were adhering to the Scottish Enlightenment. that was big in the propaganda of the War for Independence, right? And that included our Second Amendment rights, right? The right to bear arms. That was under an enlightened libertarian notion that you don't want the government to ever have coercive power over the regular people. The regular people should meet, at a grassroots level, democratically elect their own officers, train, on the weekends, and do it more democratically in a more grassroots fashion, and should not be able to be commandeered by a national standing army. So we're going to have problems with that as well, fighting in this war. And then again, just generically, we're going to need war heroes. And so we make a big deal out of a few different people. There's a guy named Stephen Decatur. There was a young man named Oliver Hazard Perry. And of course, Andrew Jackson constitute some of the big ones. But this growing sense of patriotism, right, is going to evolve during the war. And as oftentimes happens, you're probably not old enough to remember this, but I certainly am, with 9/11, right? Sometimes national tragedy has, however brief, a very galvanizing effect of unifying Americans in patriotic, passion. And so, as you may know already, and you'll see in the video, the British literally came to the White House and burnt it to the ground during this war. And so this is going to be a national disgrace, right? It's going to cause great alarm. But you might argue that by the end of the war, it had a unifying effect, whereby toward the end of the war, there was a meeting, right, in Connecticut. And in this meeting, a group of 20-something Federalist politicians and businessmen met, and they expressed their opposition to this war. And what looked terrible is their list of concerns and demands seemed to be very, very partisan, very, very just based upon their own economic self-interest, their own party's self-interest, not what was best for the country. And then there was one guy in particular, a guy with the last name Bigelow, Timothy Bigelow, who had become infamous for stating that the northeastern states ought to formally leave the country. They ought to secede from the country because they didn't like this war. And like I said, what looked bad is on their list of grievances, the war, they were angry that the war was hurting their pocketbooks. It was because they depended on their livelihood, oftentimes directly or indirectly, with trade with Mother England. So they didn't want to be at war with Mother England, obviously. So when this happens, right, by the end of the war, and then also you add into the context the great victory that Andrew Jackson had, which was ironically illegal because the war had been declared over and they just weren't informed of it. But in light of that victory in New Orleans, right, the people at this Connecticut meeting, it made them look like traitors. It made them look like unpatriotic, selfish, partisan traitors. And so that's going to have a lot to do with the Federalist Party falling apart by the end of the war. And so a lot of patriotism, right, involved by the end of the war. A lot of, however grudging, political agreement, right, that we need to strengthen ourselves patriotically as a country so this doesn't happen again. So we're no longer threatened by a foreign bully or foe, right? That we need to develop our economy, that we need to give some powers to a standing army and navy and to a federal government that can protect us, etc. So ironically, the Liberal Party wins, but they're going to largely embrace more of a conservative platform at the end of the war. But largely, like I said, under the assumption that that was our patriotic duty to become more self-sufficient and more powerful as a country. And then lastly, as you'll see in the video, is they agreed to status quo antebellum, right? Whatever the state was before war broke out, that state is to be re-implemented. So hence, whoever owned what property, whoever was in control legally as the political power entitled to sovereignty over that property before the war was entitled to it after the war. So hence, you could call it a stalemate, if you will. No territory was gained by England, by us at the expense of England, nor by England at the expense of us. But of course, with a grand exception, right? As I've already stated, is by the end of the war, we are going to take a lot of Native American lands, right? The states are going to try to do so. The federal government is going to approve of doing such to a limited degree. Again, as a punitive measure against them for fighting against us. All right. So, are there any questions? Are you sure, you guys? Because that's it.
I
That's
do
all I've
real
got.
quick,
Sure.
just to back you up a little bit, just because something you said kind of had me question. What was the reason why the White House was burned down? What was the reasoning why?
We had 3 invasions of Canada, right?
Mhm.
Excuse me. We came into our men came into York, and there was a parliamentary building there where the local government ruled, right? And remember, England, right, has control to this day under Great Britain over Canada. And supposedly, the legend states that hanging on the outside of that parliament building were American scalps taken, right? Dead American scalps taken by Native American allies of the British, and were supposedly being boasted upon these big hooks on this big brick building. We don't know. I don't think we'll ever know the extent to which that is true. But supposedly also because of certain the inability of the militia leaders to realize their goals. There's clear evidence that the commanders in particular were a little bit rambunctious as individuals, prideful men as individuals. I apologize. I wish I could remember offhand their names. But they had become very frustrated by their inability to hold York after defeating the forces there. Their inability to keep all their militiamen together, some of whom refused to cross the Canadian border. And so, in a moment of frustration and just, they decided to burn the public building down. And then, once someone had begun doing that, they began burning private homes down as well. And the British were furious about this, and it got into their press, etc. So technically, they considered it revenge for that. That we burnt down, our army burnt down York, and so they were returning the favor.
Right, almost. So it just sounds like, well, I'm curious as if it was more of like just to teach a lesson. Like, you burn us down, we're gonna
Yes,
burn
and
you
I
down.
think so as well. Absolutely, and not to mention, right, is we have evidence of this for sure, right? Both sides, both our Congress and British Parliament, and our cabinet and their executive cabinets, right, contending that we wanted to do anything, right, to gain psychological leverage, right, to gain political and psychological leverage over the other when when the time eventually arose for having peace talks, right? Because they knew that the war, like any war, ought to be finite, and so eventually, when we come to the peace table, right, you want your opponent to be psychologically broken. You want him to feel vulnerable, right? Why? Because he'll more likely concede uh, better terms to you at the peace. And that reminds me of Vietnam, right? We wanted to save
Right.
face, knowing that we were going to leave Vietnam and not permanently occupy it militarily. And our politicians didn't want to be known in history to their constituency as having lost Vietnam, despite the fact that with Vietnam, by the time of Nixon, we definitely wanted, there was public pressure to get out instead of stay in and win. But he didn't want to make it look as if he had lost for several political reasons and psychological ones. So hence, right, he bombed the heck out of Hanoi in the famous Christmas bombings, Laos and Cambodia that were providing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to help out the enemy. he tried to do all those kind of dirty things at the last minute to try to psychologically humble the Northern Vietnamese army and their Viet Cong allies to get them to make some concessions to us, right? At the peace table. So yeah, there was definitely both those factors. The gentleman, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Ross, who supposedly he was indifferent toward it. The legend states that he and others sat down and literally ate dinner in Madison's place in the presidential palace, and sat there and took their time. And people began, acting in such a way as they were going to commit arson, and he kind of just, let it happen, so that it kind of happened organically and wasn't really premeditated. Who knows? Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, thank you.
No problem. All right. Anybody else? All right. So I think, like I said, I've read the questions. I'll make sure very shortly that this is online for you. But this should be pretty cut and dry, a bit superficial, and I apologize for that. But I hope from it and or from my lecture today that you've learned the basics of the War of 1812. All right. So thank you, guys. I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. Thank you, Ali. So you guys have a nice day. All right.